So I did something pretty unusual for me these days. Lately, I actually got a new video game and played through it. I'm exaggerating slightly. I do that from time to time. There was also Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Shredder's Revenge last year. I reviewed Rise of the Third Power on this channel. I did get the most popular game of the year last year, Elden Ring, but for whatever reason, my playthrough stalled out like an hour in. I was like, there's a pretty glowing tree. Anyway, this boss killed me, so I'll come back to this game later. And then I just, like a year went by, and I never came back to it. But I have it if I ever want to go back to it. But anyway, I'm not talking about any of those games. Although I'm talking about a game similar to Rise of the Third Power, which was a retro Super Nintendo style JRPG made by Western developers. This is the similar thing. It's called Chained Echoes. I believe it came out for every system under the sun. Was it November? I think it was December actually that it came out. I downloaded it, played pretty steady for a couple weeks, then fell off for a couple weeks, played steady for another couple weeks, fell off for another couple weeks specifically to replay GoldenEye when they re-released that on Switch. But then just these last few weeks picked it up again finally and blitzed my way through to the end of the game, including all the optional areas and secret side quests and super bosses at the end. So I basically fully cleaned it out, minus some of the reward boards and a few of the side quests I think I might have missed, or did I do them all? I'm not quite sure. Hard to say. Maybe I did do all the side quests, but I know I didn't finish all the reward boards, but I did do all the super bosses, so I pretty much cleaned the game out. So I'd say I'm as knowledgeable about it as it gets, at least well enough to do a review of it. So this is a Super Nintendo style RPG. The graphics, I would say, definitely grab your eye as being Chrono Trigger-esque more than anything else, in terms of just the characters' sizes, their proportions, the way they move about on the map, the way they zoom about on the map. Actually, the default kind of movement setting in this game is pretty much a real sprint, which is kind of looks funny at points, but after you get past the initial kind of humor of everyone running around, it's probably is more convenient that way than having to hold down a button for it. And the way you have the battles kind of in the map, you see the enemies on the screen, approach them. It doesn't switch to a different battle screen, just your characters, the enemies fan out. Also very Chrono Trigger-esque. The plot, on the other hand, I'd say is a bit more Final Fantasy VI flavored, which is to say that it kind of brings together a scattered group of some military veteran types, some low-level royalty types, who kind of unite in a rebellion against a corrupt empire, and a sort of an imperial figure at the head of it, which, light spoiler alert, which shouldn't really blow your mind for a JRPG. As the game goes on, it transitions into a bit more of an apocalyptic, save the entire world from imminent destruction, from an imminent magical apocalyptic destruction scenario. Which, yeah, is very reminiscent of Final Fantasy VI in that sense. The kind of the rebellion against the evil empire transitions to fighting God. And this game follows a kind of a similar arc. Right down to it, there's actually a choose your scenario type situation, although I didn't find it quite as memorable as the one in Final Fantasy VI. In fact, I couldn't, with 100% certainty off the top of my head, even tell you how the team split up exactly, like who was in which party, so maybe it didn't stand out as me quite as much as the iconic choose your scenario in Final Fantasy VI. But anyway, so the characters do have a reasonable amount of depth, each of them, except for maybe a couple of the secret ones, or even they get a little bit of backstory, but the kind of like main 8 or so figures, Glenn, Lenny, whatever you pronounce it, Victor, the lizard man, Bathraz, I think that was his name, etc. All get a pretty good amount of depth. There's no silent protagonist here. This is definitely Glenn, our kind of main dude. He's quite talkative. In fact, Glenn might have too much backstory. Like, sticking with our Final Fantasy VI comparison, the amount of kind of like flashbacks and lore and development we get of Glenn's backstory throughout the course of the game would be like if, Terra has her Final Fantasy VI flashback sequence to her birth and like early years in the Esper world. It would be like Chained Echoes equivalent. What they do with Glenn would be like if we got 3 or 4 sequences in Final Fantasy VI of that length with Terra. So it almost goes a little too far with him. But maybe that's looking a gift horse in the mouth. But while the plot and characters, they're well done, if not really breaking the mold for the 16-bit style JRPG, I really thought they did a great job with the lore of this world. It almost felt like there was maybe a little bit of George R.R. Martin influence with the backstories of the kingdoms and their various wars and political alliances and tense ceasefires and truces and broken truces and negotiations and plenty of a backstory and history about the military histories and the kingdoms, etc. It seemed like very well developed. Like they probably spent quite a lot of time thinking this out, as much as any like fantasy novelist, for example, spends coming up with the lore of their world. It is, some of it is put right in front of you, but quite a bit of this stuff is also it's almost like Metroid Prime style, where it's in texts for you to seek out if you wish throughout the game. I mean, occasionally the game will zoom out to kind of like a map of the kingdom of Volandis and fill you in on some things, but a lot of it you kind of seek out of your own accord, if you're interested. But in contrast to like a George R.R. Martin Song of Ice and Fire, there's definitely a bit more kind of high magic in the backstory of the world as well. Both the echoes of the game's title refer to like kind of the magical lifeblood of the world and the way souls are reincarnated, and this limited pool of magic that the increasing population of the world is drawing thin, which is allowing kind of like godly and devilish figures to break through these barriers in reality. But there's also this really cool backstory lore bit about the 7 true kings, as the game calls them, basically 7, like kaiju-like beasts. And you don't meet all of them through the course of the world, but through the course of the game. But like one of them is even the moon itself is one of the 7 true kings. Although I will say it's a little bit underwhelming later in the game when you actually meet one face to face, a dragon. The way the cutscenes showing them, it led me to think that each true king was like the size of the Empire State Building, or 5 times that tall. Whereas when you meet one, it seems like a fairly regular sized dragon. So I don't know. But still, the lore is cool, both the mythology and the magical stuff and the kingdoms and political stuff. I thought it seemed like a very well thought out and developed and interesting fantasy world. So I'd say maybe the kind of story itself and the characters I give kind of a solid B to. Like, it's on the Final Fantasy Super Nintendo tier, I guess. Maybe a little bit less memorable to me than FF6, but it's on the Final Fantasy 4 level, I'd say. But the world building itself, I'd give a solid A to. I would also definitely give a very solid A+ if you're a lover of old school pixel art like I am, to the graphics. Yeah, really gorgeous stuff. Just it's great seeing this kind of it's almost like if you hadn't actually played any of these Super Nintendo RPGs in decades, which I obviously have, I replay that shit all the time. But if you hadn't, this would be like what your child's mind saw them as, just these gorgeous colors just splayed across your widescreen TV. It looks so good. These forests and rainy kingdoms and mountain ranges and creepy flower fields and sky. Of course, you got your floating kingdoms. It's a JRPG. You have to have your floating kingdoms. But yeah, the color work is all just gorgeous. It looks really good. The music, not quite up to the level of the graphics, I wouldn't say. Not bad. It's just kind of like your fantasy game audio wallpaper, I guess. Nothing on par with kind of the games that inspired it, I didn't think, but perfectly good enough. But yeah, the graphics, this is my bag, this kind of pixel art. I love the look of it. Nothing about the gameplay sequence is especially shocking. We kind of have our cinematic opening that gradually brings all the characters together. If I'm being honest, this stretch maybe goes on a little too long before we're properly in the overworld and engaged in the action. Although, I've recently tried replaying some of those PlayStation Final Fantasy games, and some of them feel like they hold your hand for quite a bit in the beginning too. So maybe this isn't too bad in that regard. But once we get out to the overworld, then we kind of have a linear sequence. We go overworld, town, dungeon, overworld, town, dungeon. With some quote-unquote dungeons that actually are overworld, technically, like the flower fields I mentioned, this creepy kind of bleached white land, swampy land with some of the hardest monsters in the game up to that point. Technically, it's outdoors. Technically, it's in the overworld, but it's a de facto dungeon because it's tough to get through. But yeah, and so you go through a linear sequence. Unlike some of those classic RPGs, it does have like kind of guide points to show you on the map where you're supposed to go. So I'm not really bothered by that. Some people are like, oh, it's hand-holding, but I'm like, you hate getting lost in some of those games and not know. That's not really fun. Maybe when I was like 10 years old and had infinite time for gaming, but these days I get a bit bored of poking aimlessly around a map pretty quickly, and I'd prefer just have the guide showing me, not forcing me where to go, because there's plenty of side quests to explore, but showing me where to go next to advance the plot. I'm happy to have that. And of course, most every dungeon has a boss at the end, and then once you get past the game's probably like midway point or so, here's some of the least shocking spoilers in the world. If you've ever played a classic style JRPG before, you get a airship, and a lot of optional content opens up, and world exploration, and well, the game does continue to guide you with the markers through the actual main story events. Now you get to re-explore to your heart's content all the old areas. Although you actually could through the whole game. There's a few nice quality of life improvements from some of the old school JRPGs. One of which is fast travel crystals, which let you, from very early on in the game, warp wherever you want instantly through. Yeah, pretty much every place in the game world has a warp crystal within a reasonable running distance, so you can go back and re-explore anytime you want, which is kind of nice because sometimes the game will plant super strong monsters. Like near early on in the game, you fight a giant yak who will slaughter you when you get out of the first village, but come back later, you can tough your way through the battle. It's difficult, even a little later, but you can maybe do it. Come back much, much, much later, and you can win in one turn. Similarly, there's these green dragons in the forest. They're the same sort of situation, so it's nice that you have the ability to warp through and maybe explore some areas that were too tough before. And there's other little quality of life things, like, for example, in the battles, enemy weaknesses, elemental weaknesses, you don't have to memorize it all. You don't have to scan anyone. From the very beginning of the game, every enemy's strength and weakness is very clearly displayed. And it's just little things like that. If you die in a battle, you can instantly either retry, and even if you retry, you get to resort your character formation and inventory and skills before you go back into it, or go back to your last autosave, which is rarely more than a few minutes back at most. So it's a game that is kind of on your side in that way, while still throwing tough battles at you. In fact, that's one kind of a change I think I liked in the battles. It seems like the dungeons are slightly reworked, and this is how I kind of like it. If I was to try to make a retro JRPG myself, this is probably what I would try to do. There's somewhat fewer battles in a dungeon than you would fight in, say, a Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy IV, well, being somewhat tougher. So fewer battles in any given dungeon, but a bit more difficult than maybe your typical SNES RPG battles. Like, I even a lot of normal enemies hit pretty hard and have a lot of health. I even died. There were totally normal encounters, not boss encounters, but normal encounters that I died a few times on trying to work my way through some of these dungeons, and it was always nice to find the strategy and try to get through them. Beyond that, the battles, they play more or less your typical classic JRPG way. You're going to use your fight command with your warriors, magic with your wizards, right? You don't get a healer until pretty late in the game, a dedicated healer, so that kind of makes almost the early game in a lot of ways kind of the more difficult relative to when you play it, because you have a few characters who have maybe one scattershot healing spell here and there, but for most things, especially for reviving dead characters in the middle of a battle, you are going to be going into your inventory. But once you get a dedicated healer, it feels like the game gets a little bit easier, a little farther into it. But yeah, it's your basic, your warriors are going to attack. Your main guy, Glenn, from the very first battle of the game, he has an attack. I think it's called a cross slash, which is 3 standard attacks. I never moved that off of his. You can put, I think, 8 abilities on each character. And as a lot of it goes through the game, you'll be swapping out for new stuff, but I always kept cross-slash on Glenn, because just those 3 hard hits, always useful all the way up through the last boss of the game, and the super boss at the end of the game. Harder than the last boss. But a lot of other characters, there's an archer guy, Rob. He's kind of like a utility player. He has paralyzing and sleep abilities and poison and other stuff. And your kind of mage sort of figure is Lenny, the princess. She has her spear. She has magical abilities to use the magic stat, the fire thrust, wind thrusts. I think there's also earth thrust, water thrust. And one guy, Victor, does all your buffs. You get your healer, Amalia, later in the game. So it's a fairly standard. The main twist is something called the overdrive bar. It's at the top left of the screen in every battle. You start in this yellow territory. As you use attacks, you'll go into the green when everything gets stronger. And I think you might use less magic points. I'm not sure. But then if you use too many attacks without using kind of a steam releasing attacks that are highlighted in yellow, it'll bring the overdrive bar down. Or a defend, you'll go into the red, and then enemies will hit for harder. So it's kind of like adds a little bit of a minor strategy puzzle element. In most normal encounters, you're not going to worry about it too much. Like if you go into the red for like the last couple hits against a normal bad guy, no big deal. But against some of the bosses, when they're hitting you like multiple times, you can it can be a little bit stressful in a good way. That adds an extra element of having to keep your eye on that bar and manage it. And you might in the heat of a battle, when you would never normally do this in another classic JRPG, like find yourself defending or using attacks you wouldn't be your ideal, because they're the ones that are highlighted in yellow. So it adds a bit of strategy to it. And especially once you get towards the end game, buffs become very important. You don't want to ignore those. Agility is so powerful it almost borders on broken in the game, which is good because it allowed me to beat some of the optional endgame bosses that I don't know if I would have otherwise. But there are a few characters get moves that'll boost the agility for the whole party, which give you a ton of additional turns relative to the boss you're fighting. And you don't want to ignore that at the end game. You also don't want to ignore your various attack up and defense up and debuffing the bosses, because this stuff all stacks in this game, and it can become extremely useful towards turning the tide in some later encounters. It almost reminded me of when I first played the very first Pokemon game, Red and Blue, aka one of the only ones I ever actually played to the end, like how useful stuff like Double Team was once you actually dug into it, avoiding attacks. This is similar, where if you ignore the buffs, then you're crippling yourself. You want to dive into that stuff. Where I found gameplay a bit frustrating maybe wasn't in the battles themselves, but in the menus between battles. There's a ton of stuff going on under the hood here, so to speak, and I didn't mind the lack of traditional levels. I thought that was actually kind of cool that we don't have the usual experience points leveling up. Instead, after every boss fight and occasionally in other events through the game, you'll get, I think it's called a Grimoire Shard, where then you can go into this giant skill tree / skill chart and either level up specific stats or give yourself new moves or kind of passive buffs. For example, fire resistance, or automatically increasing your defense once you get under 30% health in a battle, or automatic counter attack, or just all kinds of different moves, including the aforementioned stat buffs and just your standard attacks and healing moves. And that was cool. You can also level up moves, and you kind of get sort of experience points. I think they're called SP points, but you don't get levels in the traditional way. And I liked all these systems. It was cool and allowed you to strategize a little bit. By the end of the game, if you do the optional stuff, you will be able to unlock basically everything on the skill chart, so you don't need to worry too much about, oh no, will I lock myself out of the best stuff? Yeah, you almost certainly won't. But yeah, I liked being able to customize everyone's move sets. It was cool. It almost, I bring back the Pokemon comparison, except you don't have to erase previous moves to do it, so it's even better. But some of the other stuff I didn't like as much. Later in the game, you unlock these mechs called Sky Armors, and I do like the way those let you fly around previous areas to explore for treasures. That was pretty cool. But I found it frustrating the way that changing out your weapons and armor in the mechs totally messed up all your attacks in battle in a way I found very frustrating and hard to kind of get my. I never got my brain around it up through the last battle. I never was sure, like, is this right? Is this how I'm supposed to? I never quite figured out why people's moves would change with each armor, and I was kind of like frustrated by it, and I wish there had just been a much more simplified way you could manually swap your skills in and out the way you could with just the on-foot characters. So by the end of the game, I was enjoying the mech fights a lot less than the on-foot. It was cool when you first did it, but by the end of the game, I was kind of like ready to move back to just exclusively on-foot fights, which thankfully, even in the last dungeon of the game, there is plenty of that. There's also this thing where you're assigning crystals to weapons and armor to give them, again, various buffs. Like you could, HP up crystal, defense up, dark resistance, fire resistance, spear strength up. But you have to. It's more annoying than, like, for example, materia in Final Fantasy VII. You can't just do it in a standard menu. You have to find the crystals on the map and then combine them in this awkward way I never really understood, and then assign them to weapons at, like, these forges on the map. And then if you take them out later, they don't automatically get taken out. You have to use the forge for that also, and then it weakens them when you take them out. And it was just too much stuff. If they wanted a way to kind of buff weapons with these crystals, I would have just done something much more along the lines of materia in Final Fantasy VII. Just you can pop them in and out at will whenever you want on your standard menu, anytime, anywhere, any place. I would have preferred that if they didn't want them to have skills attached to them like the materia does in Final Fantasy VII. That'd be fine. They could have kept the skills to the skill tree and just had the materia equivalent only do stat changes and resistance changes and stuff. So yeah, for me, the battle system itself and the use of buffs and all that and the overdrive bar, that's a thumbs up. Some of the mech stuff and the crystal stuff, a little more of a thumb sideways, leaning down. I thought it was just a bit few too many systems altogether. It got a bit convoluted in a way that kind of detracted from the experience a little bit, maybe. But, like I said, it was always satisfying to come back to areas later, like the green dragons in the forest I mentioned, and kind of then just carve through enemies that used to be very threatening, right? And speaking of very threatening, this game does have super bosses at the end, a la Omega and Shinryu in Final Fantasy V, or Emerald and Ruby in Final Fantasy VII, or even Sar Dragon in not the original Final Fantasy VI, but the Advance Edition for Game Boy Advance. But they're not too tough. The very top end boss, not the final boss of the story, but the final secret super boss, he killed me my first few times trying to fight him, just because he has 3 attacks at once. So he used, I think, a move called X-Slash 3 times in a row and just slaughtered my party. Not much I could do about that. But once I was able to kind of get my foot in the door and set up my agility buffs and my defense and get my healer rolling with the spells, and use Glenn's break attack to lower the enemy stats a little bit. Once I got my foot in the door past the first couple of past the first couple of rounds, then I beat him on my first try. And I didn't do a ton. I didn't find every ultimate weapon or master the perfect party by any means. I just kind of went in with my standard strategy that I would have used for any super hard boss. And once I was able to get my foot in the door with the agility buffs in particular, I was able to beat him on my first try. But yeah, the game, one thing I'll definitely give this credit for, and this is something I also said earlier last year about another retro-style indie JRPG, Rise of the Third Kingdom. This is not like a quick buck sort of a thing that what's that company, Kemco, that puts out all those shovelware JRPGs. This is not a 5-hour playthrough. This is not a 10-hour playthrough. Not even a 20-hour playthrough. This is feature length. I would say this is longer, maybe like a quarter again as long as Final Fantasy VI. That is, if you do the World of Ruin to completion. This is a feature-length game. My playthrough ran about 50 hours. I only used a guide. I didn't use a guide for the main game, because like I said, you always had the marker showing you what to do next. Some of the optional endgame stuff, the secret areas, I was kind of like, I'm not going to... The game does not guide you to that as much, like finding the elemental tablets. And so with that, I just pulled up the guide online and I followed along. But I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm not going to spend another 20 hours scouring every square inch of the game world for little missing MacGuffins. I'm just going to use a guide for that. So I did. But other than that, I played through pretty much the whole game the old school way with what the game provided me, which admittedly is more than some of those old school games with the location markers and whatnot. But yeah, there's a ton of dungeons. There's tons of achievements in the form of the reward board, where it gives you like little tasks to do through the game world. Unique monsters to find, kind of like little secret bosses. Plenty of side quests, lots of towns, and tons of stuff to do. Tons of cutscenes to watch. Like I said, maybe a few too many in the backstories. A lot of fair number of puzzles to solve. There's these kind of not sliding block puzzles per se, because I think you're moving a magical orb, but these de facto sliding block puzzles. They reminded me almost verbatim of the Super Nintendo game Goof Troop, if anyone's played that, where you have these orbs where you hit them and they don't stop until they hit a wall, and they're kind of like these little logic puzzles. I didn't mind the first few. Some of the last few were a little much for me. They took a little bit of a long time. It's not that I have any objection to that type of gameplay. Like, I like the Adventure Lolo games on NES that are very much these sort of block puzzle geometry kind of brain teasers. I just don't necessarily like them to like being a super hard extent in the middle of kind of a JRPG where I'm managing menus and whatnot. Just kind of like, I don't know, it's like what would be two foods? It's like if I had some fried chicken in the middle of my ice cream, right? It's like I like both these things. I don't necessarily want them in the same bite, But it's a full length RPG, both in terms of the main story, that's the mandatory quest, but also tons of like optional and side content. Like, you're not going to be playing this like, where's all the bonus stuff to do? Oh, it's the game will have you taken care of there. There's a ton of it. Like, definitely a few hours of secret dungeons worth at the end you could do or not do. So minor spoilers about I won't say exactly what or who the last boss of the game was, but it's kind of a Neo X Death at the end of Final Fantasy V type final battle, where the magical being of a somewhat eldritch abomination, kind of a jumble of stuff, slides in magically floating from the end of the screen. Although the shape and color of it, at risk of sounding like a AVGN knockoff, it looked way too much like a piece of poop. The last boss was the general shape and color of a bowel movement, and I wasn't too sure about that. I was a little, I don't know about that. So I'll just pretend that the super boss was the actual final boss of the game, because that was a little bit more of a godly and majestic figure. Yeah, and then the ending itself, again, I won't say exactly what happens, but of all games, I found it reminiscent, not of any Final Fantasy or Squaresoft games at all. I found it extremely reminiscent of Terranigma. Yeah, it had a heavy parallels and a similar, almost a similar ending shot to Terranigma, if anyone's played that. Great game. Not a JRPG exactly. It's more of a Zelda-style adventure game with a little bit of menus, but more of an action RPG. But yeah, overall, Chained Echoes, not total perfection by any means. I could have used a little bit of a readjusting of some of the crystals and some of the stat stuff, and I could have lived with maybe 20% less flashbacks and backstory of the main character. I got a little, but other than that, yeah, if you love playing a JRPG with a beautiful pixel art, where you kind of your squad of ne'er-do-wells and miscreants comes together to fight the evil empire and explore overworlds and dungeons, and it's pretty good stuff. It's pretty good stuff. I can't see any scenario in which anyone who loves like Chrono Trigger, for example, would not enjoy this game. Like, they may not like it as much as Chrono Trigger, but I would be shocked if anyone who's a Chrono Trigger lover played this game and was like, oh, that sucked. I just couldn't see that happening. So yeah, if you're it would be almost hard for me to choose between Rise of the Third Power and Chained Echoes, which experience I preferred, but I had a pretty fun time with both of them. Chained Echoes definitely has better graphics and more innovative battle system with the overdrive bar, a little less traditional. Rise of the Third Power is maybe the dungeons I found a little more engaging, but I don't know. Yeah, you should play. If you're a retro RPG fan, I would say play them both. Absolutely. So yeah, Chained Echoes a thumbs up for me as an RPG lover. I'd love tons. I would love tons more games like this. I love this kind of thing. It's my main video gaming comfort food. It's like I do play occasional, platformers and first person shooters and what other genre? My main two comfort foods for gaming are JRPGs and Metroidvanias. So yeah, I'd love to see more stuff like this. I dug it. So yeah, check it out.